So, guys, I want to talk about black fatigue and I want to talk about, black moms. And first of all, I do want to say that, in the black community, there are issues with like black mothers and stuff like that. And definitely when you watch like videos on Instagram, it's either like, encouraging their sons to be effeminate or encouraging their sons to steal. There's a video of this woman who brought her kid to a store. The little boy shoplifted and she was like talking about fighting the cashier register. And then there's also like, child abuse and other things like that as well, really. But like, disclaimer, as we all know, this is not all African American women. The other thing too is that in the white community, there's a lot of times where, people raise their children to be spoiled brats, talk back to adults. Sometimes, there's the issue of women raising their daughters to manipulate men or be sociopaths, or lie about, being sexually assaulted. Or like, you look at every single time when there's a school shooting, usually when it's a white child, they always blame it on mental illness, really. So, and then also, as I said, in Japanese culture, there's a lot of misogyny. In Asian cultures, there's a lot of misogyny. There's also a lot of, you know, um, boys being taught to treat women like they're subservient, really. So it's not just an issue of black women. Every group, every race has a culture that is destructive. So I want to talk about my experiences, negative experiences around black moms. And I also want to talk a little bit about my life and a few other things like that and dissect things. That the first thing that I want to talk about is that I used to work at a store called Conway, and what would happen at Conway was that there was a lot of theft, really. So I remember like one day there was this woman with her like 3 year old baby, and what she would do is like she was taking a lighter. Mind you, she was right next to alcohol and other like items, and she would just be burning the plastic off off shoes because she wanted to steal them. And she was like, you may leave, boy," and you don't tell me what to do, really. And mind you, she's doing this right in front of her kids. So this was also an example of like a bad of the ghetto fatigued black woman, really. Shoplifting, disrespect, confrontation, being an bad example to her kids, and also unapologetic, like definitely like almost sociopathic in a way, like, oh well, like my behavior doesn't stink, really. And I dissect this in a couple of ways. And I think that what people have to forget is that, sometimes when black people act all ghetto and thug, really, you have to understand that it stems from a couple of things. And one of the big things it stems from is how white people traditionally treat black people. Because if you look at like a lot of times in black culture, black people had communities in Africa. White people took them away to support slavery. So they were robbed by the black bodies were robbed by white people. And then when you had Black Wall Street and other things like that, where black people tried done for themselves, really, those are destroyed by white communities, and there was not a lot of reparations or whatever. And then also, I think what happened really is that a lot of time like, after Martin Luther King got assassinated and other black figures got assassinated, in hip hop culture, it was almost like teaching people, okay, well, America's not fair to you, so we're gonna be unfair as well, really. Or not having respect. Um, as 50 Cent famously said, "Get rich or die trying." That culture kind of like got really, really popular, really. So I really think that a lot of the black fatigue or the ghetto mom is really just a response to what's been passed down with black trauma, which is ultimately like if you show respect, you do the right thing, you get screwed by the system, and the system is not made for black people to be successful. Really, I've talked about in my filmmaking career about how I came in, I did the right thing, I showed respect, and I was disrespected, or I worked at many jobs where I've I've had bad experiences around it with racism or bad experiences around being paired with ghetto people, really. And I think that if I was white or Jewish, I probably would have been treated way better in the workplace and other things like that. So I think like with this woman, that's probably what it was, really. It was that probably that culture of, you know what, society is not going to give you a favor, so you ultimately need to steal what you steal or misbehave really. And then I also think that it comes to the ghetto attitude where it's almost like, as I said, you look at how mean it was for white people to destroy black communities and other things like that. So that's an example of saying, okay, well, if people show respect or people do other things like that, why should if white people were disrespectful, destroyed black communities, used the N word, did a lot of horrible things to black people, why should we treat people? Why should we treat people with respect or anything like that? Really. I also just want to mention, as well, in the black community, that I also feel it also comes from like the hip hop culture as well, because like hip hop culture, the gangster rap, that has had a huge influence on many black people. Like it's the same thing. Like when I was a kid and Sopranos were popular, there was a lot of white people saying the N word and being disrespectful and other things like that because people are inspired by a culture. Or like you look at a lot of entitlement that happens nowadays. That's kind of inspired by Instagram with how you see people doing crazy things, other people do crazy things. So and like we live in a huge like disrespect culture because that's kind of been because that's kind of been like inspired by Instagram. But I think that a lot of times when people or black moms are really rude and disrespectful, I think it comes from a lot of the rap and hip hop culture because part of like in those lyrics is anger, aggression, no accountability. It's all about me getting my way or getting what I want really, and I think that has a huge impact on the African American psyche really. Like people listen to that, it's part of the culture, and ultimately it glamorizes rewards that type of disrespectful behavior. I also think that there's some generational trauma in families. Like a lot of times in the black, and this is true in the black community, that there are many families with single moms. There's many families with women getting pregnant at a young age, and I think that behavior's become normalized. But like I've said, I've gone to a high school. I've seen white girls get pregnant. I've seen Latino girls get pregnant, but it's more normalized in the black community to dysfunctional family. And as I said, it does come from a lot of different things. It came from the generational trauma of slavery where families were separated. It also came from people growing up with abuse, like physical abuse, sexual abuse, unstable families, and that came from slavery because that was when if a slave master saw an attractive black woman, he could rape her as much time as he wanted to. He could do something like get all like the women together and have them be raped by their relatives if they wanted to. And then when that's kind of passed along, or when someone goes through trauma and that's passed down a couple of generations, um, you know, um, it stems into this type of behavior, really. But also, too, you watch shows like Good Times, and I remember like the thing with Good Times, they originally wanted to be about a black woman with three kids and a man that walked out and stuff. So like a lot of times in media, they do that with black women. Or you look at a show like Tyler Perry House of Pain with like CJ and all those people. Like the mother is a crack addict. She burns down a house. Everybody's expected to forgive her. It teaches that when black women act crazy and ghetto, we got to be forgiving, and that's another thing I want to talk about. But there's been a lot of times, I think, in black media where it's kind of normalized dysfunctional families or our violent behavior. And then I also think the last part of it is forgiving black women. And this is kind of like a bad thing, is that my philosophy is that if you do anything bad in your life, you have to be held accountable. So movies like like in The House of Pain, if CJ and the family want nothing to do with the mom who was a crack addict, burned down their house and everybody's inconvenience, or when the kid goes to the high school and he's embarrassed because everybody's saying that his mom's a crack whore, they're making fun of the fact that he has a burned down house, really, where do we hold women responsible? Because a lot of times in American culture, this is true. Women are not held responsible. Women are seen as victims. Women are seen as if they're bad mothers. Their sons need to forgive them. And that's also very evident in black culture as well, really, where women are always seen as the victims, or women are always seen as, oh well, maybe they wouldn't been that way if their black male partner didn't walk out on them. You know, we have to hold bad behavior accountable, really. Or sometimes when we watch the things like the Target store being robbed by three black children a few weeks ago in Texas, you know, there's a lot of people like saying, okay, where's the black dad? Where's the black dad? This is a poor black woman with three black children. We got to feel sorry for her because the black man walked out, really. Because there's always that thing, too, when when black people do bad, really, that there's always a sense of, you know, some people saying that famous line, "Where's the father? Where's the father? Where's the father?" That's just the black family. The father's not there, really. There's no really accountability on the mother in a lot of situations, really. But we need to start putting accountability on women as well, really, because if not, we're going to live in a world where it's just like, okay, you know, it's the gender, really. You know, everybody needs to be held accountable for their behavior. And as I said before, and I'll say it again, you look at Asian communities, you look in Japan, there's a lot of times where men are sexually abusive to their daughters, or there's a lot of misogyny in that culture, really. So, you know, men need to be held accountable if they engage in that behavior. Or, in, as I said, in the white community, I've known many people who are women who are either sociopathic or they raise their daughters to manipulate men or hurt men or lie about men to get charges put on them, and unfortunately, that's something that does happen, really. So we always have to kind of, you know, in a way, really understand that. As I said, it's not just black women. That's just that's an issue with all cultures as well, really. But it's definitely in the black culture. These things I'm talking about. There's the impact of dysfunctional families. There's the impact of media. There's impact of gangster rap. There's an impact of this entitlement culture that we live in. There's also really an impact of really just, you know, of also just apologizing for bad behavior. The other incident that I want to talk about is that I worked many jobs in my life, and I used to work at a hospital a few years ago, and I remember like one time I was talking to this woman, just saying like, hey, you know, the hospital accidentally told me to clean your room because they put it in as like a discharge. And I remember like this woman like holding her kid, and she was like, you know, get the fuck out of my room, the fuck, and being really rude. And it kind of goes down to like what I've said before about everything I was saying prior, which was, you know, a lot of that things that happens in black culture of, you know, rudeness, disrespect, no meditation on your own behavior. And like I've said before, that, you know, and also not just being like, okay, maybe we shouldn't be stereotypes because, you know, that hurts the black community, really. You know, like, why do we have this need to be disrespectful women? And then, like, as I said, there's Tommy Sotomayor and other people talk about saying like the worst mother is the African American woman, really, because they always seem to have an attitude, they always seem to be violent, they always seem to never take accountability, they always seem to be child abusers, and they always seem to always be like, you know, seen as victims, or always seen as, okay, if a black woman is in a bad mood or if she's disrespectful, really, it must be because she doesn't have a man taking care of that baby. And then also too, some of it is because of Rochelle from Everybody Hates Chris, because there's a lot of, because she's almost become a role model for how black women should behave when that is a satire. And part of, you know, and she exhibits all those things, you know, rude, loud, inconsiderate, putting blame on her husband for her behavior, really, you know. So, you know, that's part of that black fatigue, really, where you know, there has to be like betterment, or sometimes when there's women like Oprah or Michelle Obama, they need to be, you know, examples of how of role models of black moms, really. But that is that's a big issue too in the black community is really just this fatigue of the ghetto moms and stuff like that, and this unapologetic behavior. But like I've said, that I think it stemmed in generational trauma from all the things that happened during slavery, and then all the things that happened after slavery when blacks try to have better opportunities. There was Black Wall Street and a lot of and Rosewood and other communities being destroyed. Then you also look at those conspiracies about the government putting drugs in the black community and everything's like that. So it's almost like if that behavior is passed down, really, that becomes like a social norm. People are going to engage in it whether or not it is good or destructive.